Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm honored to welcome Professor Jeremy Elan Garlick, Director of the Masaryk Center of International Studies and Associate Professor of International Relations and China Studies at Prague University of Economics and Business as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Jeremy's research primarily explores the Belt and Road Initiative, China's relations with Central and Eastern Europe, China-Middle East relations, and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. He is also the author of Reconfiguring the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, Geo-Economic Pipe Dreams versus Geopolitical Realities, which written in 2021, and The Impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative from Asia to Europe. Professor Garlick holds a PhD in political science from Palaki University, Olomouc, Czech Republic, and an MA in international relations from Staffordshire University. In this episode, Professor Jeremy will share insights from his book, Advantage China, Agent of Change in an Era of Global Disruption. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Jeremy Garlick to the podcast. Professor Jeremy, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Dr. Jeremy, your research on China's relation with other countries is truly remarkable. Thank you for your valuable contributions to this important field. What inspired you to write Advantage China, and what key messages do you hope readers take away from it?
Well, that's a very good question. What inspired me to write it? I think because it's really the end result of about 10 years of research, So I started thinking, living in China and thinking about China from 2008, and I started seriously kind of researching China from about 2010, 2011. So it's really like the end result of that process. But really what inspired me is I've read from, in many parts of the Western media, particularly Western media, US media, European media, and also from some Western scholars and so on, that, China is failing or China is collapsing or China's economy is collapsing or China is going to, the government's going to collapse or something like this. So I was inspired to really show that I don't think that's the case at all. And I think China is much more resilient than people, especially people in the West, think. I don't think it's so much about people in Asia. I think people in Asia kind of understand this more, right? Although maybe some of them would hold that opinion also, but I think they understand more. But I think it's people in the West, people in Europe, people in the US. Some of them have the idea that China is weak or China, can't innovate or something like this. And I wanted to show that China is much more resilient than they think, and that China has also certain advantages over the West. I mean, we tend in the West, we tend to assume that we have the best political and economic systems and so on, and that we should show everybody else how to do things. And I wanted to kind of demonstrate that there are some lessons we can learn from China's approach. I mean, I'm not saying we should copy China altogether. Of course, I'm not saying that, but I want to say that there are certain aspects of it that I think China does better than the West, right? There are certain things the West does better, but there's certain things that China does better. And I think that China is gradually getting advantages from this, particularly, and this is why I have it in the subtitle, agent of change in an era of global disruption. I think we now see, when I wrote the book, this was when Biden was still president, and now we have Trump as president. And I think there was already a kind of disruption in the global system. And now I think the disruption is intensified. So I think particularly in these kind of circumstances, China is getting some advantages. And I think the West doesn't see it. The West is kind of not looking at it, and they're not paying attention to what China is doing, particularly in the global South, I would say.
In your book, you discuss Western misperceptions of China's rise. What are some of the biggest misconceptions, and how do they shape global narratives about China?
Well, as I already mentioned, I think one of the misperceptions has been that China's, economy is collapsing, or that China's political system is unsustainable because the Chinese people don't believe in it, so that it's going to collapse, it's going to be overturned. And I think those are two of the misconceptions, the economic situation, the political situation, and another misperception that I've seen recently, even from, I have to say, from a US academic, I heard this, that China can't innovate, that China is not capable of innovating, right? So these are some of, these are some of the misperceptions, So regarding the economy, and I think we might come to this later on, but I don't think it's true that at all that China's economy is collapsing. It's true that they have some problems. They have definitely structural problems and problems with, for instance, the housing market, but it's not true that it's collapsing. The same with the political system. There are certain weaknesses, there are certain problems with it, but it's not true that it's collapsing. And regarding the innovation, I think we can see, from some of the AI that's coming out of China, this DeepSeek and so on. I mean, okay, so people would argue there are some elements of copying of the West. Yes, but there's also some, ability to innovate, their ability to take existing technologies and maybe improve them or innovate on them. And it's certainly not true that Chinese people can't innovate because of their political system or something like this.
Professor Jeremy, how has China's Belt and Road Initiative evolved since its inception? And what long-term impact do you see it having on global trade and geopolitics?
Very good question again, because I did a previous book on the Belt and Road Initiative. So I've studied this as well. But it does come into this book. It's definitely a big part of this book as well. And the Belt and Road Initiative was launched in 2013, as we know, and it's very closely associated with President Xi Jinping. It's really his initiative, right? And I think at the beginning in 2013, when he made a speech in Kazakhstan, and then he made another speech in Indonesia about this Belt and Road, I think nobody understood what it was or what it meant. And it only started taking off around about 2015 when the Chinese, government themselves started catching up with it and coming up with a plan for what it was supposed to be. And I think everybody at that point, 2015, 2016, everybody understood it was mainly about infrastructure. It was about investing in transport and energy, development and projects to connect together, Asia and Europe, or Asia and Africa, Asia and the Middle East, basically connecting countries together. That's how everybody understood it. And the Chinese, particularly around 2016, 2017, there was a rush to invest in various countries in the Middle East, in Europe, in Central Asia, in Africa, even in Latin America. There was a rush to invest. And I think what happened was that we now see less investment. We see lower levels of investment. We saw the highest levels of investment around about 2016, 2017. We saw the levels of investment go down because, for one reason, the Chinese government realized, well, there's too much money going out, and a lot of it is being spent unwisely. So, for example, I'm here in the Czech Republic. They bought a football club here, right? Why did they buy a football club? They don't need a football club, right? They bought a brewery. They don't need that. So there was a concern that a lot of money was being spent unwisely. So they reined in the spending. They reduced the spending. But I think they continued the investment, but they directed it more onto key projects. So I think the key projects within it are usually transport and energy infrastructure. Those are the biggest areas that China's been investing in. And yes, we do see now lower levels of investment than a few years ago, particularly since COVID. We see lower levels of investment, but it still continues. It's not to say, again, a misperception in the West is that the Belt and Road has failed or something like this, or it doesn't work. It's not true that it's not working. There are problems with it. There have been projects that have failed. Some of it doesn't work, but there are parts that do work, and there are parts that have boosted China's image in some countries. Not all countries, but a lot of countries in the global South have been very happy to receive Chinese investments and want to continue receiving them. Probably more, they want probably more money than the Chinese are prepared even to invest.
Professor, some critics argue that Belt and Road Initiative is a form of debt trap diplomacy, while others see it as a driver of economic growth in developing regions. What is your perspective?
This again is a very good question because this is something that's been hotly debated. And I think we need to define, what is a debt trap? What is debt trap diplomacy? And I think what people have agreed on is something is a debt trap if China is loaning money for a project. A state bank in China is loaning money to a country for a project. The project's being built by a Chinese company. So the money is going from the state bank through the government of that country to the Chinese company. And then the government of that country is not able to pay the money back. And the debt trap is supposed to be that, the Chinese will exchange the debt for some asset in that country, right? Whatever they've built, maybe they build a port and they would like to get hold of the port and run the port, or they would like to get hold of some other asset, maybe some piece of land or something in that country. So the idea of the debt trap is that China would be trapping a country into getting into debt and then exchanging the debt for something to its advantage, right? So I think the problem with it is that there's a famous case of this in Sri Lanka where we have Hambantota port, where the Sri Lankan government couldn't pay back some money it owed to the Chinese. So the Chinese took over that Hambantota port on a 99-year lease. So this is the evidence that's usually given of a debt trap. But in fact, this was done with the agreement of the Sri Lankan government. The other thing would be that you can't find any other cases of this. There are no other cases of this where the Chinese have taken over some asset in exchange for debt. You can't find any other examples of this. In all the other cases, there are cases where countries can't pay back their debts or they're having trouble paying back the debts, but the Chinese have not actually, taken over any assets, or forced anybody into giving them assets in other cases. So from my point of view, and I think there's sort of academic literature that supports this, there's some doubt about this debt trap diplomacy idea. What I would say, I would qualify this by saying that when the Chinese lend money to a country and do projects there, they obviously want something from that country. So even if we don't talk about debt traps, I would say what they want something there. And what they want often is influence, right? They want to build up influence. So if by debt trap we mean greater influence in that country or over that country's politics, then that might be the case. But I don't think, strictly speaking, in terms of economics, that would be classed as a debt trap. But sure, the Chinese want to get something. Sometimes they want something like oil, right? They want a good deal on oil. They want to get some cheap oil if the country has oil or some other assets. So they are looking to get some advantage, obviously. But every country does this, right? Every country does deals that are to its advantage. So I don't think China's necessarily unique in this. What is unique about China is that it's lending money from state banks directly. I mean, other countries are not usually doing that. So the system that China uses is different to other countries. So I think that's what worries people. And, there are reasons to be concerned, but strictly speaking, we don't see much evidence of debt trap in the strict sense.
How is China's expanding influence in Africa, Latin America, and Central and Eastern Europe reshaping the global balance of power?
This again is a very good question because there's a lot of, I think China's biggest influence is in the global south, if we can count some of these regions and what we call the global south, either developing world. So I think it is changing the global balance of power. And where we see, I think, evidence of this is through things like BRICS, BRICS, which means Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are the key members. And we see an expansion of BRICS. I mean, now I think there are 10 members of it. So they've added other members to BRICS to become BRICS Plus, and there's some Middle Eastern countries and other countries that are joining it, and there are other countries that are joining as observers. So as this, for example, expands, we see what it means is it's a change to the global order because this is an organization that doesn't include Western countries, right? It's not the G7. It's not NATO. It's not a Western run or organization. So we see an expansion of Chinese power. But in those regions you mentioned, Africa, Latin America, Central and Eastern Europe, China has set up, there's a thing called the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, where China gathers together with leaders of African countries and they discuss things. And this again is done directly between China and African countries without input from the West. Same thing in Latin America. There's an organization there again where China meets with Latin American countries. And it has, just to mention other regions, there's also a China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. So they're also meeting with the Arab states leaders. In Central Asia, there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes Russia, Central Asian states, and it also includes India and Pakistan as members as well now. So those organizations, those regional organizations, some of which are expanding, like the SCO, BRICS, are changing the global balance of power. The one exception I would make out of the regions you mentioned, Central and Eastern Europe, I don't think I think that's the one, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule because it hasn't really worked in Central and Eastern Europe. The Central and Eastern European countries there is an organization set up for cooperation with China. It was called the 16+1, and then they added Greece, so it became the 17+1. It's now become the 14+1 unofficially because Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania all pulled out of it. So there's a feeling that one is not really working. But as I say, that's the exception that proves the rule because the other ones, there's some problems, there's some things going on in those. But I think on the whole, those are boosting cooperation between China directly with, global South countries, developing countries, without the West being present. So that's changing, in my view, the complexion of global affairs, that the West is excluded from these things.
Professor Jeremy, China's economic rise has been remarkable, but it also faces challenges such as slowing growth and demographic shift. How do you see these internal pressures affecting its global ambitions?
Well, again, a very good question because that's something that people have focused on. That China's economic rise is indeed remarkable. I mean, since Mao died in 1976 and Deng Xiaoping took over in 1978 to 79, China had a prolonged period of growth, 10% GDP growth on average per year, or 8 to 10%. It is slow for 30 years or more, right? It has slowed down. It slowed down to 8% and 6% and 5%. And now the latest target they've just set in the two sessions meeting, which they just had in Beijing, the target for this year is 5% GDP growth. So it has slowed down. The economy has slowed down. But we're still talking about growth. I mean, we're still talking about 5% growth. So we're not talking about a recession. We're talking about slowing growth. I mean, other countries, Western countries, would be, happy to get 5% growth, right? But as you mentioned, slowing growth internally in China, yeah, there is slowing growth. They are having struggles to boost the economy, to boost the consumption in the domestic economy. Demographic shifts, big problem for them because, the demographic pyramid, it should look like a pyramid, like this shape. It should be the younger generation is the biggest and the older people is the smallest portion, so that you have the younger people supporting the older ones, providing money for them. And what we see in China is, it's not a pyramid anymore. It's like a sort of thing with a bulge in the middle. The biggest generations are in the middle. And what we're going to see is, the younger generation, because of the one-child policy and low birth rates in China, the younger generation is going to be smaller than the middle-aged generation, and later there's going to be an older generation. So it's almost going to be not quite an inverted pyramid, but going towards that direction, which is not good for the economy, because if you have too many old people supported by too few young people, then it's a real problem for the economy. How do you keep the economy growing? So this is a severe problem, and I think they are trying to find ways to cope with this and stimulate the economy. And I think they're thinking about this all the time, and it is a problem, and I think it does reduce somewhat their global ambitions, because as we've seen with the Belt and Road, the amount of investment going out of China has reduced, and it has affected their ability to perhaps invest as much abroad as they would have liked to originally. So I think it does slow down their global ambitions, and it does slow down their ability to grow and be, dominate the global economy. But I think at the same time, they're kind of calculating that in, and they're still calculating in a sort of slowing rate of growth into what they're planning. So it's slowing it down, but I think it doesn't mean that China's collapsing or that China's going away, because it's not going away.
The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted economies worldwide. How has China adapted its economic strategy post-pandemic, and what lessons can other nations learn?
Well, yeah, COVID-19 disrupted everybody. I think this is one area where China actually struggled with this, because they had lockdown, and they had very severe kind of limitations on people's movements and so on during COVID. And I think this is one area where they probably really locked down for too long, right? And it slowed them down in those years. So I think and then they very suddenly, people started protesting more and more, and then they very suddenly released the pressure and opened it up again. I think they did, I have to say, it seems that they did mismanage this somewhat, right? They didn't really uh, figure out how to deal with COVID, and it sort of slowed them down. And I think what lessons can other nations learn, I think, is to, when you have a lockdown, the lockdown needs to come to an end as soon as possible. And I think that the other countries did end them sooner. And I think the Chinese went on too long with it and should have ended it sooner, right? To start stimulating the economy again. And also to start, it's very important in China. People don't realize, but it is an authoritarian regime, but they still have to listen to the people. I mean, it's a huge number of people there. If the people don't support the government, if most of the people don't support the government, they are going to have a problem, and they are in danger of losing legitimacy. They do need to convince most of the people that the country's going in a relatively positive direction. And that means keeping the economy growing. It means improving people's lives, improving people's access to healthcare, education, housing, jobs, and so on. If they can't persuade most of the people that their lives are going in a positive direction, then they will lose legitimacy. So they do have to keep that going. And I think with COVID, I think they kind of got it wrong, that they locked down for too long.
In your book, you discuss how the West should adapt to China's rise. What strategic shift do you believe Western government and businesses need to make?
Well, I think the West is not really uh, is not as organized as it should be. It's not as coordinated as it should be. So what the argument I make in the book is that China gets accused sometimes of being not chaotic, or not being very organized, or being somehow fragmented. I don't really believe this is the case. I think China is pretty organized, pretty coordinated, and they tend to have a consistent long-term strategy. I mean, the Western people don't necessarily see it. They think that China's inconsistent, but what I see is consistency of policy in the long term. I mean, there are shifts along the way, things happen and they make adjustments, but the overall direction of it is relatively consistent, relatively coordinated. And I think where the West is losing in this case is that it's not as coordinated as China. It's not as consistent, and the part of the reason for this is, as we know, if you have a democratic system, you're going to have changes of government. You're going to have elections where you have a sudden change from one party to another, And that's where you get inconsistent. You get sudden changes of policy direction. You get sudden shifts. And this doesn't lead to coordination or consistency. It doesn't lead to people believing that things are going to go in a steady direction. I mean, I'm not recommending that everybody, adopts China's system, but China does have an advantage that it doesn't have to have elections, it doesn't have a democracy, it has the same government, it has even the same, president for more than 10 years. It can keep going in the same direction. They can make more long-term plans. They don't have to have such sudden shifts. And if I can just make a, comparison here, I mean, what we see in the US right now when we're recording this is a very sudden, it's an example of what I'm saying, a very sudden shift from the Biden presidency to the Trump presidency. We see extreme shifts in policy. We see extreme shifts from, an anti-Russia policy to suddenly apparently pro-Russia policy. And then just today, just a couple of hours ago, I'm now seeing that there's a possibility that Trump is again going to put sanctions on Russia. And I mean, these kinds of shifts backwards and forwards, I don't think are very good for planning. They're not very good for the economy. They're not good for stock markets. It makes everything very unstable. And people have accused China in the past of not being consistent or being unstable, but I think China is more consistent and stable than the West in this respect. And it's somehow the West needs to get more together and be more coordinated. In the book, I was, talking about Europe and talking about the US, and that ideally the US and Europe would work together to develop strategies, or if the US and Europe can't work together, then at least Europe needs to come together. And what I see right now is I don't see the US and Europe working together at all. But and perhaps there is a chance, as I'm saying in the book, that maybe the fact that the US is now seems to be not cooperating with Europe, it maybe is bringing the Europeans more together. And what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 days even is just maybe Europeans coming together more in a more coordinated way to cooperate with each other, especially on the Ukraine issue, right? So overall, basically what I'm saying is the West needs to be more coordinated, and it needs to have more consistent long-term policies if it wants to compete with China, right?
Professor, is there room for constructive engagement between China and Western economies, or are we heading toward long-term geopolitical competition?
Very good question. This is something that's in flux. I mean, I've been, I was 10 years ago, I was more optimistic about this, and then I became very pessimistic about this, particularly after COVID hit in 2020, because then the atmosphere between China and the West became very tense and very kind of negative. And it had been, even the 2 years before that, it had been going in that direction. So I became very pessimistic about cooperation between China and the West. It's been looking like long-term geopolitical competition. I just wonder now, we're in a situation where obviously there's a lot of tension between Russia and Europe, with the US being, now with Trump, it's a bit of a wild card. So there's a lot, as we're speaking, as we're recording this, there's a great lack of clarity. I don't know if somebody watches this in a month, maybe it's all going to be clearer. I don't know. But right now, it's very unclear situation between the US and Russia. But I just wonder, with regard to China, like what this is going to mean. Does this mean that perhaps China could work more with Europe if the Europeans get together? And I don't know. It's a big if, it's a big question mark. I'm not sure, because the problem is that there's a lack of trust, I think, between the West and China. There's certainly, I mean, we've seen, these US is putting more tariffs on China. So under Trump, so I don't think there's any trust between the US and China. It's very, very difficult. Whether there could be more cooperation between China and Europe, I'm not sure. I'm not entirely optimistic about this because of the lack of trust. So I'd have to say, guessing it's more towards geopolitical competition, right? I mean, that seems to be the way we are heading, but I would hope that it's not going to be too much in that direction, but it does seem to be heading that way.
How do China's cultural and political systems shape its approach to diplomacy and international relations?
Yeah, I mean, if I don't want to go too much into Chinese history for this or Chinese culture, but if we there's a thing called Confucianism, which has had a great influence in Chinese history and in Chinese political systems. This goes back more than 2,000 years. The influence of Confucianism in Chinese politics has been very strong. I mean, we all know about communism, but I think it's often Confucianism is not, emphasized. And the influence that this has is Confucianism emphasizes, it doesn't emphasize the individual. It emphasizes the collective. It emphasizes the benefit of the collective. It emphasizes social harmony, which means, doing things for the benefit of the majority. So what this means from a Western perspective, Westerners don't like this because it means you're not paying attention to individual rights. You're not looking at individuals. Some individuals are getting crushed. What the point of it is to benefit the majority, to make the system work as well as possible for the majority of people. This is kind of coming out of Confucianism, and in this it matches, I think, communism as well. I mean, the two systems don't seem to match. And in Chinese history, Mao tried to crush Confucianism and get rid of it, or get rid of the traditional culture. But I think even his thinking was influenced by Confucianism. And I think the two things, there is some degree of match there. So what it means is, China has, I think, a political culture of emphasizing the collective, also of emphasizing, benefiting, trying to benefit people, trying to get people out of poverty, trying to get people better educated, trying to get things growing. I mean, this is what it's emphasizing. It's not emphasizing individual human rights, which is where the West has a big problem with China. So this I think is one of the driving forces of Chinese political economy that I try to, I don't really emphasize it too much in the book, but it's there in the background.
With increasing tensions over Taiwan, the South China Sea, and technology, how should global leaders navigate these complex issues while maintaining economic lies?
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah, we do have. I mean, there are these ongoing tensions with Taiwan, South China Sea, technology such as AI. Um, how should leaders navigate these complex issues? Well, I think the answer is with great difficulty. I mean, because these issues are complex and difficult. I mean, for example, the Taiwan issue goes back into history. It goes back to the Chinese Civil War after the Second World War. It goes back to the fact that the communists won the Chinese Civil War in 1949 against the nationalists, the Kuomintang, who lost. And the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, right? So the communists were in mainland China and the nationalists ended up in Taiwan, where they still are today. So you have this problem with Taiwan where both the government of the People's Republic of China and the government of Taiwan both tried to claim to be the legitimate government of China. Both try to claim that there is one China and they are both part of it, right? They're not disputing that. So this question of Taiwan is quite a difficult one to solve because this is even endorsed in the UN. The UN has decided there's only one China, there's only one legitimate government of China, which is the People's Republic of China. So Taiwan is, even in the UN, is not recognized as a country. It's not represented in the UN. So how do you solve this problem? I mean, with the threat of China, a China-Taiwan conflict, or China trying to take over Taiwan. It's been a difficult problem to solve since about 1949, basically. And how do you solve it? It's one that has to be managed somehow, and it's a difficult one. South China Sea, similarly, China claims the whole of the South China Sea. Vietnam and the Philippines in particular are not happy about this, are not happy about China's naval activity expanding into their neighborhoods, or Chinese vessels threatening ships from the Philippines and things like this. How do you solve it? Again, it's a difficult one because it's been taken even to a court of arbitration, world court, and that they found in favor of the Philippines. But if China does, as happened, they refuse to recognize this decision, then how do you manage it if they're not going to acknowledge it? So, how do we navigate these complex issues while maintaining economic ties? With great difficulty, I would say. It's not an easy thing to do. It's difficult, but of course, as we know, China is the world's factory. China is the source of many of the world's manufactured goods. As long as that's the case, then the world will just have to navigate it, because if you disrupt the economic ties, the whole global economy is going to suffer. So I think they have to somehow just keep going through these problems, and these are kind of like frozen problems. I think Taiwan and the South China Sea, and I don't think there's going to be an easy solution to these, and we just have to somehow navigate through it and somehow find what's best for everybody.
Professor, based on your research, what role do you see China playing in the future of the global economy and political order?
Well, based on my research, I see China playing quite a dominant role in the global economy and political order. I mean, especially as I've mentioned in the global South, I think China sees itself, China regards itself as still belonging to the global South, although I think they now, would see themselves as transitioning towards being a richer country. I think they've always still seen themselves as a member of the global South, and I think what they like to see themselves as is a leader of the global South, right? As a country which can bring together countries in the global South, many of which, probably almost all of which, are former colonies of European countries, right? They all have this colonial experience. And China also has this colonial experience, because China, was, this Hong Kong, which was a British colony, as Macau was a Portuguese colony. The Germans also had a possession in Qingdao for a while. The Japanese also occupied China for 15 years. So the Chinese also say that, that like the other countries in the global South, they have this post-colonial experience, which is like a shared experience. And they want to present themselves as a leader of the global South, and that the global South can develop together, economically, politically develop together, and present a kind of unified front to boost themselves against not against the West, not against the richer countries, but more to balance it out, right? To try to balance out these inequalities in the global economy, and not just in the global economy, but also in the global political system, which has tended to favor the richer countries. I mean, if we look at something like the G7, I mean, the G7 is all the rich countries coming together making decisions. It excludes global South countries, right? So what China said is, okay, you've got the G7. Well, we're going to set up BRICS, because you're leaving us all out of it, right? So we're going to set up a rival organization, and we're going to try to build something up that benefits the global South, the countries that were colonized. So I think this is going to be something where China plays a very strong role in the global economy and political order.
Professor, if you could recommend one key mindset shift for policymakers and business leaders regarding China, what would it be?
Well, one key mindset shift, I think there are probably several, but I think one is, to stop thinking that we are better than China, right? I'm talking about the West. I'm talking about the West here. I think there's an assumption in the West that we can't learn anything from China, that we just need to fear China, that there's something wrong with China. It's very strange. We can't understand it. But also a kind of lack of respect, I mean, I think Chinese often emphasize this, that they feel there's a lack of respect coming from the West. And I think the West needs to have more respect for China and more acknowledgement that China's not doing everything wrong. Not everything coming out of China is automatically bad, that there are some things coming from China that even if, we maybe don't like them, they are changing the global order. They are, even maybe in some cases beneficial things, right? So I'm thinking of things like technological innovations that China has, like AI is a mixed bag. It's difficult to say what's good and what's bad, but China is going to be a leader in AI. China is going to be a leader in many technologies. I mean, computing and perhaps drones and hypersonic missiles, some of its military technology and so on. Not everything, so the key mindset shift would be to have more respect for China. I'm not saying you don't have to like China, you don't have to love China, you don't have to think that China's right. You can criticize China, whatever, but I think there should be more respect for China, that they do know what they're doing. They do have things that they're doing that are working, and we shouldn't just automatically assume. And I'm sorry to say, but I think in the West this is the case. There's an automatic assumption that they are somehow worse than us, that they're somehow wrong and they're not as good as us. And I think that's got to change, because I think that kind of disrespect for China is it's just not productive in the end, and it's not going to be good for the West, because it's underestimating China. It's underestimating China's ability to change things and to be strong in the world, and that's not good for the West, because it's affecting decision making and calculations. They need to make decisions more on the assumption that China does know what it's doing, and it's not always wrong about everything.
Professor, my last question. What's next for your research? Are there any upcoming projects or books that you are currently working on?
Well, it's kind of two things that I'm working on. One thing I've already worked on. I've just published a book with Cambridge University Press about evolution in international relations. Right, I'm not going to go into the whole thing here now, but I'm actually quite pleased with that book, and it's not. It's the first thing I've done that's not directly about China. So it's more about relations between countries and how understanding evolutionary psychology and lessons from evolution can help us to understand from an objective viewpoint why countries relate to each other in the way that they do. For example, why do countries go to war, right? When we would all prefer there not to be wars. We would prefer cooperation. Economic cooperation would be better for everybody. Why do countries still continue to go to war? And I think there are some very solid evolutionary reasons why that's the case. It's all about the survival of your group, right? In ancient history, your group was threatened by outsiders. You had to fight back, and I think it's programmed into us to compete with other groups, and we need to understand that. So I won't go into any more detail on it, but I'm quite happy with this evolution in international relations book. The other thing that I'm working on, and I'm just starting to work on it, and I have some people I'm cooperating with, is we're trying to, going back to China, we're now, most of what I've been doing is looking at what China's doing in the global south and so on. What we're going to do next is to look at the responses of global south countries to China. So we're going to try to look at not just what China's doing, but what is the response to it from global south countries. So what is the response from Asian countries, countries in the Middle East, countries in Africa, countries in Latin America? How do they view China? Do they view China positively, negatively? Do they like certain bits? What are they doing? What is their agency in this? It's not just all about what China does, but it's about what those countries are doing. So I'm very interested actually in looking in more detail and depth at what countries are doing in response to China. Yeah.
Listeners, as we conclude this insightful conversation, I want to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Jeremy Alan Garlick for joining us today. His expertise in international relations and China studies has provided us with a deeper understanding of the evolving global landscape and the critical role China plays in shaping it. Through his book Advantage China, Agent of Change in an Era of Global Disruption, Professor Garlick challenges prevailing narratives and offers thought-provoking perspectives on how the West can adapt to China's rise. His extensive research on the Belt and Road Initiative, China's geopolitical strategies, and the China-Pakistan economic corridor has been instrumental in advancing global discussions on these pressing issues. Professor Garlick, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the Business Talk. Thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. I'm very happy to be here and talk about my book. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you, Professor.